You know, people think the worst kind of pain is when someone yells at you, curses you, tells you straight to your face they don't love you anymore. But sometimes it's quieter than that. Sometimes it's just a pause, a look, a few words so light you could almost miss them, until they stay lodged in your chest like a shard of glass you can't pull out. That's what happened to me on the morning of my child's graduation. If you're watching this, maybe you've been there, on the edge of a moment that was supposed to be proud, happy, shared, and somehow it turned into something you can't quite tell without your voice breaking. And if you've ever been pushed away by the people you love most, maybe stick around. Hit that like button, subscribe if you want to hear the whole story, because this isn't just about me. It's about every parent who's ever stood in the shadows, loving in silence. I woke up before the sun that day. I'm not usually a morning person anymore. Not since I retired from my job at the hardware store. But that morning I was up at 5. My knees ached when I swung my legs off the bed, the cold floor reminding me that summer hadn't fully arrived yet. I brewed my coffee in the old Mr. Coffee machine, the one my late wife bought decades ago. The smell filled the kitchen, and I let it sit on the counter while I went to get dressed. I had laid the clothes out the night before. A navy blue suit I'd bought secondhand from a thrift store 2 towns over, a white shirt that had seen better days, and a tie my wife once said made me look almost dashing. The suit had a slight shine to it in certain light. Cheap fabric will do that, but I pressed it carefully, running the iron over every wrinkle. I'd even polished my shoes, though the scuffs were too deep to hide. In the mirror, I practiced my smile. Silly, right? But I wanted to look presentable. Like a father my kid could be proud of when they spotted me in the crowd. My hair had thinned, silver now instead of black, but I combed it neatly. I thought about the years it had taken to get here. The long nights, the early mornings, the paychecks stretched thin so tuition could be paid, books bought, rent covered. I thought about every time I'd sat alone at the kitchen table, bills spread out, calculator in hand, wondering if I'd be able to cover it all, and somehow I always did. That morning, I wasn't thinking about the hard parts, though. I was thinking about the look on my child's face when they saw me in the stands, cheering. The drive to the university took just over an hour. I played old country songs on the radio, the ones we used to sing along to when they were small and still thought my voice was good enough for car concerts. I passed the time imagining the moment. They'd walk across the stage, shake hands with the dean, look up, and there I'd be, clapping, smiling, eyes shining with pride. I pulled into the campus parking lot earlier than I needed to, just to be sure. I spotted my child standing near the entrance, gown draped over their arm, talking to a couple of friends. My chest swelled seeing them, taller now, confident, ready to take on the world. I stepped out of the car and called their name. They turned. For a split second, their face lit up like when they were a kid and I'd surprised them at school pickup. But then something shifted. Their smile faltered. They glanced at my suit, my shoes, my hair. "Dad," they started, walking toward me, lowering their voice as they got closer. Maybe you shouldn't, come inside." I laughed, thinking it was a joke. "What are you talking about? Of course I'm coming in." They looked over their shoulder as if checking to make sure no one was listening. "It's just your suit, it's kinda, I don't know, not the right vibe. My friends are all here. Their parents, I don't want to make it awkward." I felt the words land slow and heavy. "You don't want me there." "It's not that," they said quickly. "It's just today's about me, I don't want people thinking, just maybe you could watch from outside, please." They didn't wait for me to answer. A group of classmates called out to them and they gave me this small, apologetic smile before jogging off. I stood there, holding the moment in my hands like it was made of glass and had just cracked. The air felt colder than it had when I left home. My polished shoes suddenly looked like a joke. I could have pushed back. I could have walked right past the doors and taken my seat. But instead, I turned back toward my car. I sat there for a long minute, hands on the steering wheel, watching people file into the auditorium. Fathers in sharp suits, mothers in bright dresses, cameras hanging around their necks. I thought about starting the engine and driving home, pretending I'd never made the trip, pretending it didn't hurt. But I stayed, because no matter what my child said, I still wanted to see them walk across that stage. From where I parked, I could see a corner of the stage through the rain-speckled windshield. The sky had turned gray, the air thick with the kind of humidity that makes everything smell like wet concrete. I turned the wipers on just once, so the drops wouldn't smear too much. Inside, I could hear the muffled voice of the announcer, the occasional burst of applause. My chest tightened every time the clapping started, wondering if it was for my kid. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a little voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, one day they'd understand what it cost me to sit here instead of inside. I leaned back in the seat and stared at the raindrops racing each other down the glass. Funny thing about rain, it makes you remember, or maybe it just gives you an excuse to sit still long enough for the memories to catch up. The last time I'd been on this campus, it was move-in day. My old pickup had been so full of boxes that the rear bumper scraped every time I hit a pothole. We unloaded everything together: mini fridge, microwave, too many bags of clothes. I'd carried the heavy stuff while my kid arranged posters on the wall. Back then, they didn't mind being seen with me. They'd even hugged me in front of their new roommate before I drove away. That was 4 years ago. Now here I was, a parking lot away, not because I'd been late, not because there wasn't space inside, but because I wasn't presentable enough. I watched families walking past my car. Some stopped to take photos with their graduates, holding bouquets and gift bags. A father in a tailored suit wrapped his arm around his daughter, and she laughed so hard she had to wipe her eyes. I wondered if she knew how lucky she was. I shifted in my seat, the fabric of my thrift store suit pulling at the shoulders. It wasn't uncomfortable until this morning. Now it felt like it was wearing me, like a costume that fooled no one. The announcer's voice crackled faintly through the air, distorted by distance and weather. I caught snippets: cum laude, outstanding achievement, honors program. Each name was followed by a wave of clapping that rolled through the crowd like surf hitting the shore. When my child's name finally came, it was almost drowned out by the rain drumming harder against the roof. I sat up straighter, craning my neck to see. Through the watery blur, I spotted a figure crossing the stage. Even from here, I recognized the way they held their shoulders, a little too stiff, like they were trying to look taller. They shook the dean's hand, accepted the diploma, and smiled for the camera. I clapped in the quiet of my car. It was a small, awkward sound against the rain. A flash of memory hit me. First day of kindergarten, them clutching my hand so tight my fingers went numb. I'd stayed outside the classroom door until I was sure they'd settled in, just in case they needed to see me there. Back then, my presence was a comfort. Now it was something to hide. I told myself it was just the age. They were young, they cared about appearances, about fitting in. Maybe I'd been the same once, though I couldn't remember ever sending my own father away. A knock startled me. I turned to see a young man standing outside the passenger window. Hood pulled up against the rain. He gestured for me to roll it down. "You okay, sir?" he asked. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just watching from here." He glanced toward the stage, then back at me. "You one of the parents?" I nodded. "Why aren't you inside?" I hesitated. Long story. Something in my tone must have told him not to push, because he just nodded, gave me a quick congratulations to them, and walked away. I watched him join a group of friends under a shared umbrella, laughing as they splashed through puddles. The ceremony ended not long after. Graduates tossed their caps into the air, the black shapes flying like startled birds. Families rushed in to hug them, the kind of joyful chaos that makes you forget the weather. I stayed put. My hands gripped the steering wheel, not because I was ready to drive away, but because I didn't trust myself to open the door. Through the windshield, I saw my child surrounded by friends, posing for photos. They didn't look toward the parking lot once. Maybe they didn't know I was still here, or maybe they did, and that was the point. I thought about walking over just to say congratulations, to tell them how proud I was. But the image of their uneasy face that morning stopped me. The last thing I wanted was to make them flinch in front of their friends. So I started the engine. The wipers swiped in time with the low hum of the motor. As I pulled out of the lot, I passed clusters of people still celebrating. No one noticed the old sedan leaving. On the drive home, the radio played the same country songs as before, but I didn't sing along. My suit jacket felt heavier now, the tie too tight. I loosened it at a red light and caught my reflection in the rearview mirror, hair damp from the dash to the car, lines deeper around the eyes, mouth set in something halfway between a frown and nothing at all. I told myself this was just one day, that it didn't erase the years I'd been there, the nights I'd stayed up worrying, the mornings I'd gone without so they could have enough. But deep down, I knew it would be a day I'd remember for the rest of my life, not because of the ceremony, but because I wasn't part of it. And I didn't know it then, but somewhere in that parking lot, someone had seen me. Someone had raised a phone, snapped a photo of the man in the old suit watching through the rain. That photo hadn't found its way to me yet, but it would. And when it did, everything would change. I didn't go straight home that day. Instead, I drove past my turn, kept the wheel steady until the familiar streets gave way to ones I hadn't seen in years. I told myself I just needed to clear my head, but the truth was, I didn't want to walk into my empty house yet. It felt too soon, like stepping into silence before the echo of the morning had died out. The rain had slowed to a mist, the kind that clings to your skin but doesn't quite soak through. I parked near an old diner on the edge of town. It was the kind of place where the coffee is always burnt, the pie tastes like it's been sitting out since the afternoon before, and the same four regulars hold down the corner booth. I slid into a seat by the window, the vinyl cushion sighing under my weight. The waitress, a woman about my age with her hair piled up in a messy bun, brought me coffee without asking. "You look like you need it," she said, pouring until the cup was nearly brimming. I managed a small smile. "You have no idea." While the steam curled up between us, I thought about the moment at the school's entrance. I had been so close, close enough to hear the murmur of the crowd, to see the flash of cameras as families took their seats. If I'd taken just a few more steps, I could have been inside. I remember pausing at the base of the stairs, one hand on the railing. The bricks of the building were darkened by the rain, the mortar lines like veins on an old hand. I could see the doorway ahead, graduates slipping in with their gowns flaring behind them. And I stood there telling myself I had every right to go in, while another part of me, quieter but sharper, told me not to cause trouble. I've been raised to believe that sometimes love means stepping back, giving space. My father had done it for me, though in my case, I didn't realize the weight of that choice until he was gone. Maybe I was repeating the same mistake. The coffee was bitter, but it warmed me. I stared out the window, watching water bead and run down the glass. People hurried past, hunching against the drizzle. None of them knew where I'd been, what I'd seen, or what I hadn't been allowed to see. A few hours earlier, I'd imagined walking up those steps with my head high, shaking hands with other parents, waiting for the moment my child's name was called so I could cheer louder than anyone else. That picture had been replaced now, with me standing in the rain, my reflection faint in the glass of the entrance door, and the sound of my own feet turning back toward the parking lot. I took another sip, and an image came to me, clearer than the rain-blurred ceremony had been. My kid at 10 years old, wearing a second-hand suit for a school recital, standing on stage while the sleeves swallowed their wrists. They'd looked out into the crowd until they found me, and when they did, they grinned so wide the whole room seemed to brighten. I had clapped until my hands stung. No one cared that the suit didn't fit or that my tie had a coffee stain. They'd been proud just to see me there. Somewhere between then and now, something had shifted. I didn't know if it was them, me, or the world around us. But I knew the walk from my car to that door would stay with me. Not because I hadn't made it inside, but because I'd been stopped by the very person I thought I'd been walking toward my whole life. The bell over the diner door jingled, snapping me out of the thought. A couple came in, both still damp from the rain. They laughed as they shook off their coats, oblivious to how lucky they were to move through the world without second-guessing their welcome in it. I stayed there until the coffee was gone, and the plate of pie crumbs in front of me was all that remained of my late lunch. When I finally stood to leave, the waitress gave me a look, not pity exactly, but something close. I left a tip larger than the bill and stepped back out into the mist. The drive home was quieter. I didn't turn on the radio. My thoughts filled the space instead, looping back to that railing, that door, that choice to turn away. It wasn't just about the suit or the shoes or the vibe. It was about being told, without the words outright, that I didn't belong. When I pulled into my driveway, the rain had stopped entirely. The air smelled like wet pavement and the faint sweetness of lilacs from the neighbor's yard. I sat there for a minute before cutting the engine, the silence in the car pressing in. Inside, I hung my suit jacket over the back of a chair and loosened my tie completely. The house felt too big, the walls too bare. I wandered into the living room, sat down in my old recliner, and stared at the empty space on the mantel where my wife's photo used to be before I moved it to the bedroom. I wondered what she would have said if she'd been there today. I could almost hear her voice, gentle but firm, telling me I had a right to be inside, that our child should have been proud to have me there, no matter the suit. She wouldn't have cared about appearances. She would have cared about the look in my eyes when I turned away. And maybe that's what hurt the most, not just the rejection, but the absence of the person who would have stood beside me and walked me through that door anyway. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the sound of the earlier rain replay in my head. It was easier than thinking about what might come next. I didn't know it yet, but the next chapter of this story wouldn't be written by me. It would be written by the click of a stranger's phone camera somewhere in that parking lot. And that image, it was already out there, starting its slow climb into the world. They say rain can wash things clean. Streets, sidewalks, the dust off the air. But as I sat in my car that day, watching the water blur the world outside, I learned rain can also hide things. It can hide your face when you don't want anyone to see it. It can hide tears you're not ready to admit are there. The parking lot wasn't full yet when I first pulled in. I'd chosen a spot near enough to see the auditorium doors, but far enough that no one would think to wave or call me over. My old sedan creaked as I shifted in the seat. The springs complained, same as my knees when I get up too fast. At first, the rain was light, just a few drops ticking against the windshield. I rolled the window down halfway, letting the air in. It smelled like wet asphalt, that faint tang of oil rising from the pavement. Across the lot, families hurried toward the entrance, some huddling under umbrellas, others just making a run for it. The laughter carried across the damp air like something from another life. I'd brought my camera with me, the same one I used to take to Little League games. Back then, I'd fill the memory card with blurry shots of my kids swinging at pitches, their face twisted in concentration. Today, the camera stayed in its case on the passenger seat. There was nothing for me to capture that wouldn't also remind me I wasn't part of it. From where I sat, I could see the top corner of the stage through the open doors. The ceremony hadn't started yet. People were milling around, finding their seats. I imagined my kid in the waiting area with the other graduates, adjusting their cap, maybe laughing at a joke someone told. For a moment, I let myself believe they were thinking of me. The rain picked up, smearing the view into watercolors. I turned the wipers on for one pass, then off again, leaving the glass streaked. It was almost better that way, less sharp, less real. A tap on the hood made me jump. It was a man I didn't recognize, middle-aged, wearing a ball cap that had seen better days. He leaned down to my window. "Everything all right, friend?" he asked. I nodded. "Just watching from here." He studied me for a second, then gave a small nod. "Well, stay dry." He walked off without waiting for an explanation. It struck me how quick strangers are to leave you alone when you look like you've already been left. Inside, the ceremony began. The muffled voice of the announcer drifted out in fragments, caught between the wind and the rain. Every so often, applause would break out, swelling like a wave before receding into the steady drumbeat on the roof of my car. When my kid's name was called, I sat up straighter. Through the blur, I caught a glimpse, A figure walking across the stage, the gown swaying, the tassel brushing their shoulder. My hands lifted, clapping in the solitude of the car. It felt both right and ridiculous. A few minutes later, a group of people darted across the lot, laughing and shouting as the rain came down harder. One of them, a young woman with a camera, paused for just a second, pointing the lens toward the auditorium. I didn't think much of it then. I didn't know her. She didn't know me. The rain became a curtain between me and the rest of the world. I leaned back, letting the sound fill the car. It was steady, almost comforting, like the white noise machine my wife used to keep by her side of the bed. But beneath it was something heavier, an ache in my chest that wouldn't ease. I thought about the things I'd wanted to say that morning, how proud I was, how every sacrifice had been worth it, how this moment was as much mine as it was theirs. But words like that need a place to land, and I wasn't sure I had one anymore. The ceremony ended with a swell of cheers. I saw caps flying into the air, black against the gray sky. Graduates poured out into the lot, hugging family, posing for photos. I stayed where I was, engine off, hands on the steering wheel. For a moment I considered starting the car and driving away before my kid came out, but my hands wouldn't move. I watched as they stepped outside, surrounded by friends, the diploma clutched in one hand. They looked happy, really happy, and they never looked toward the parking lot. I told myself that was a good thing, that they didn't have to see me like this. But deep down, a part of me wished they'd glance over even once. The rain slowed again, drops turning to mist. I turned the key, the engine rumbling to life. As I pulled out, I passed a group of students laughing under a shared umbrella. One of them held a camera close to their chest, water still beading on the lens. I didn't know it yet, but that camera had caught me, sitting alone in my car, suit wrinkled, eyes fixed on the stage from a world away. And that image was about to travel farther than I'd ever gone. Rain has a way of turning glass into a canvas. It doesn't care if you want the view clear or not. It paints anyway, dragging long streaks across your vision, blending shapes until the world becomes a memory instead of a moment. That's how it felt, sitting there in my car after the ceremony, watching the parking lot dissolve into fragments behind the water on my windshield. It was almost like my life was being replayed in the glass. The first scene was a kitchen table covered in overdue bills and grocery store coupons. My hands were younger then, less veined, less marked by years of hard work. I was calculating whether I could afford the new sneakers my kid needed for school without skipping the electric bill. In the end, I bought the sneakers. The light in their eyes when they opened the box was worth the darkness that week. The rain shifted, and so did the memory. Now I saw a small bike with training wheels, leaning against our old fence. My kid was 5, maybe 6, wobbling across the patchy lawn while I jogged behind, one hand on the seat. "Don't let go, Dad," they'd called out, their voice half terrified, half thrilled. I promised I wouldn't, but I did just for a second, and they pedaled on their own. When they realized it, they looked back at me, grinning so hard they nearly toppled over. Another streak of water carved its path down the glass. This time, I was sitting in a metal folding chair at the back of a middle school gym, the air smelling faintly of sweat and popcorn. My kids stood on the stage, clutching a piece of paper, their voice shaking as they read their part in the school play. I'd cheered loud enough for them to find me in the crowd. That smile, wide, proud, felt like it belonged to me. The memories kept coming, each one brought to life by the way the rain broke the light into soft, shifting colors. The day they got their college acceptance letter, we'd been in the living room, the envelope torn open on the coffee table. They'd screamed, actually screamed, before throwing their arms around me. I tried to hide the way my own eyes had filled, not wanting to make it about me. Moving day, the truck sagging under the weight of everything we'd crammed into it. I'd carried box after box up the narrow dorm stairs, my back aching, but I hadn't cared. I'd have carried the whole world if it meant giving them a better start. And then the memory shifted, sharp and cold. This morning, the way their eyes had flicked over my suit, my shoes, the hesitation in their voice when they'd said I should maybe watch from outside. I blinked hard as if that could clear the glass and erase that image. But it stayed, burned into the surface like something permanent. The rain eased for a moment and I could see the parking lot more clearly. A few families were still there, taking pictures under the gray sky. My kid was gone now, maybe off to celebrate with friends, maybe already home changing out of the gown. Either way, I wasn't part of it. I thought about turning the key and driving away for good. Not just from the parking lot, but from the idea that I'd always have a front row seat in their life. Maybe I was fooling myself. Maybe my role was shifting and I hadn't realized it until today. But then another memory came, this one quieter, softer. My kid, maybe 10 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with a plate of birthday cake. Everyone else had gone home, the paper plates and streamers half collapsed. They'd looked at me and said, "Thanks for making it special, Dad." That was it, no grand speech, just that. And I'd known in that moment that my presence was the gift. The wipers clicked on automatically when the rain picked up again, swiping the glass clean for just a heartbeat before the drops returned. I realized that was life in a way, moments of clarity breaking through, only to be blurred again by the next storm. I leaned back, let the sound of the rain fill the silence. My hands rested on the steering wheel, the leather worn smooth by years of use. Somewhere in that parking lot, unseen, someone had taken my picture. I didn't know why or what they'd do with it, but if they'd looked close enough, maybe they'd have seen the truth, that behind the glass, behind the suit, behind the rain, there was a father who would have stood in any weather just to be close to his child. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm, not loud enough to drown out the outside world, but insistent, like it was reminding me I wasn't going anywhere soon. I decided to sit a little longer before driving home. Maybe I was waiting for the lot to empty. Maybe I was just avoiding the moment when I'd have to walk into my quiet house and admit to myself that this day hadn't gone the way I'd hoped. That's when I noticed them. A couple, probably in their 40s, pulling into the spot 2 spaces over. Their car was a late-model SUV, paint still shiny despite the weather. The woman in the passenger seat glanced my way briefly, then turned to speak to the man driving. They both looked comfortable, like they belonged here. I pretended to check my phone, though I wasn't really reading anything. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the woman get out, pop open a large umbrella, and make her way around to the driver's side. They stood there for a second, looking toward the auditorium, then started walking in my direction, not toward me but past me to get to the path leading inside. As they drew closer, the man caught my eye and gave a polite nod. "You headed in?" he asked. I hesitated. "No, just watching from here." He slowed a little. "Oh, you waiting for someone?" "My kid," I said simply. "They're graduating today." The woman smiled, but there was something in her expression, curiosity, maybe even confusion. "Why not go inside? It's a big day." I could have told them the truth, that my kid had asked me not to, that I'd been turned away not by a stranger but by someone I'd raised and loved for over 2 decades. But instead I just said, "I've got a good view from here." The man nodded like he understood, though I wasn't sure he did. "Well, congratulations," he said, and they walked on, the umbrella bobbing as the rain tapped against it. I watched them until they disappeared into the crowd near the doors. I wondered what story they'd tell when they sat down. Would they mention the man in the old sedan, sitting alone in the lot? Or would they forget me before the ceremony even started? A few minutes later, another figure appeared. This one was younger, maybe early 20s, wearing a sweatshirt with the school logo and jeans darkened by the rain. He carried a camera slung across his chest, the strap worn from use. He stopped halfway across the lot, raised the camera and pointed it directly at me. I froze, my hand still on the steering wheel. He lowered it after a single click, then jogged toward the building without a word. I didn't know why that small act made my chest tighten. Maybe because, for a split second, someone had really seen me, not just as another parent in a car, but as a moment worth capturing. I wondered if he'd even keep the photo, or if it would end up buried among hundreds of others from the day. The rain began to ease again, the drops thinning into a fine mist. A family came out of the auditorium, laughing as they huddled together under a too-small umbrella. The father, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped one arm around his daughter, pulling her close to keep her dry. She didn't pull away. She leaned in. I looked away, my throat tight. That small scene, so ordinary, hit harder than I expected. It was the kind of closeness I'd always assumed would last between me and my kid. But here I was, watching it from a distance, like it belonged to someone else now. Another couple passed by, the woman glancing at me with a polite smile. I nodded back. In the span of half an hour, I'd exchanged more silent acknowledgments with strangers than words with my own child. The thought stung, but it also made me realize something. Strangers don't carry the weight of your history. They don't know the times you've failed or the times you've shown up in ways no one else ever saw. They only see the version of you that's sitting there in front of them. And maybe that's why they can look you in the eye without flinching. A gust of wind rattled the branches of a nearby tree, sending a spray of droplets across my windshield. I started the wipers again, watching as the view cleared for a second before blurring over once more. Somewhere in the lot, I caught sight of the young man with the camera again, now standing near the entrance. He had the lens pointed at the graduates streaming out of the doors, but every so often his eyes flicked back toward the cars, toward me. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I just sat there, letting the rain and the strangers move around me like I was part of the scenery. If I'd known then that the photo he took would soon circle the globe, I might have gotten out of the car, stood up straighter, maybe even adjusted my tie. But I didn't. I stayed exactly as I was. An old man in a thrift store suit, watching life happen through a sheet of rain. The sound reached me before I saw anything. It rolled out from the auditorium like a wave, the kind that rises slow but crashes hard, cheering, clapping, the occasional whistle that cut through the rain. The crowd had started to settle into the rhythm of the ceremony. Name, applause, name, applause. Each burst of sound swelled and faded, carried by the wind across the parking lot to where I sat. I turned the engine off again so I could hear it better. Without the low hum under my feet, the cheers felt closer, like I could almost step out of the car and be part of them. A group of latecomers hurried past my window, jackets pulled tight, shoes splashing through shallow puddles. One man muttered something about almost missing it as they jogged toward the doors. I envied their urgency. I had all the time in the world and nowhere I was allowed to be. From my spot, I could just see a sliver of the stage through the half-open side doors. Gowns moved in a steady line, each graduate climbing the stairs, pausing for a handshake and a photo, then disappearing offstage. The clapping never stopped for long. Every name got its moment, no matter how big or small their story. When the announcer's voice called my kid's name, my chest tightened. It was loud enough to reach me over the distance, even muffled by the rain. I sat forward, eyes fixed on the blur of motion on stage. There they were, shoulders squared, head held high, walking across that platform like they'd been doing it their whole life. I clapped, alone in the car. 3 sharp slaps of my palms together before I realized how absurd it must look from the outside. But I didn't care. In that moment, pride overruled everything else. The applause from inside swelled, and I imagined their friends cheering, maybe even a teacher or two who remembered the kid that used to hand in essays late but always with something worth reading. They shook hands with the dean, accepted the diploma, and flashed a smile for the photographer. From here, I couldn't tell if it was a real smile or the practiced one you give for cameras. The rain had started up again, steady and cold, but I barely noticed. My eyes stayed locked on the spot where they disappeared offstage. I wanted to believe that somewhere back there, as they took off their cap or straightened the diploma in its case, they thought of me. A fresh round of cheering erupted for the next name. Then another. The ceremony rolled on, indifferent to who was in the crowd and who wasn't. That's the thing about milestones. They happen whether or not everyone's there to see them. I leaned back and listened, letting the noise wash over me. It was the closest I'd get to being inside without crossing the line my kid had drawn that morning. Another burst of movement caught my attention. A cluster of graduates slipping out a side door, laughing and shoving each other playfully. One of them was the young man with the camera from earlier. He paused, scanning the lot, and his eyes landed on me again. For a moment, I thought he might walk over. Instead, he lifted the camera, snapped another photo, and gave a small nod before disappearing around the corner. The cheers began to fade after that, replaced by a muffled hum of voices as the ceremony wound down. People were starting to leave their seats, their conversations spilling into the drizzle. I knew that soon the parking lot would be full of families reuniting, hugging, taking pictures under umbrellas. I'd be sitting here, engine running, waiting for a gap big enough to slip out unnoticed. But for now, I stayed, listening, holding onto those sounds like they might keep me warm for the drive home. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a thought I didn't quite believe yet began to take shape. Those cheers, the ones I'd been hearing from the edge of it all, they weren't the end of the story. They were the start. When the last round of applause faded, the parking lot began to stir like a waking animal. Car doors slammed, engines turned over, voices rose and fell under the steady whisper of rain. I sat still, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the small rivers form along the cracked pavement. Through the windshield, I saw graduates spilling out of the building in twos and threes, their black gowns flapping behind them like wings dampened by the weather. Parents and friends clustered around them, arms wrapping, cameras flashing, umbrellas tilting as people tried to fit everyone into the frame. The air was thick with laughter, with relief, with the kind of joy you can't fake. And me? I stayed in my seat. Part of me wanted to get out, to walk over, to at least say congratulations to my own kid. But the memory of that morning's hesitation, the way they'd looked at my suit, at my shoes, kept me glued to the seat. I didn't want to risk another moment of being told, in so many words, that I didn't belong. I watched from a distance as they came out with their friends. The diploma case was tucked under their arm, their cap tilted back, damp hair curling at the edges. They were laughing at something someone said, head thrown back in a way that reminded me of when they were little. That laugh had been my favorite sound in the world once. I waited for them to look around, to scan the lot, to maybe spot my car, but their eyes stayed on the people around them. I told myself it was better this way, that I'd let them have their moment without the weight of me in it. A cluster of umbrellas drifted past my car, blocking my view. When they moved on, my kid was gone, swallowed by the tide of bodies and rain. I turned the key, the engine humming to life. The heater coughed before blowing a thin stream of warm air. My hands tightened on the wheel. I glanced once more toward the entrance, but no one was looking my way. As I eased out of the parking spot, I saw the young man with the camera again. He was standing under the awning, scrolling through the screen on the back of his device. Then he looked up, saw me passing, and lifted a hand in a small wave. I nodded back. For a second, I wondered if he'd taken that earlier photo of me and deleted it. Maybe it was just another meaningless shot to him, one of hundreds he'd captured that day. But I didn't dwell on it. The rain on the road demanded my attention. I pulled out of the lot slowly, passing lines of cars waiting for their turn to leave. No one honked. No one waved me through. I was just another vehicle merging into the flow, slipping away unnoticed. The windshield wipers kept time with my thoughts, steady, repetitive, almost hypnotic. I replayed the day in my head. The drive up, the walk to the door, the turn back to the car, the hours spent watching through the glass. Each memory felt like a stone I was putting in my pocket, heavier with every mile. By the time I reached the highway, the rain had softened to a drizzle. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence felt more fitting, like a companion who understood without asking questions. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house looked smaller somehow. I sat in the car for a while, letting the engine idle, staring at the front door I'd walked through thousands of times. There was no one waiting inside. No party, no balloons, no cap and gown draped over a chair. Just the faint smell of coffee from the morning and the echo of an empty living room. I shut off the engine, stepped out into the damp air, and locked the car behind me. My shoes left wet prints on the porch. As I opened the door, I caught my reflection in the glass. Tired eyes, suit jacket wrinkled, hair matted from the humidity. A man who'd been close enough to hear the cheers, but not close enough to be part of them. I didn't know it yet, but that wasn't the last time this day would follow me. Somewhere out there, in the memory card of a stranger's camera, I was still sitting in that parking lot, frozen in the moment before I drove away. And that version of me, he was about to be seen by more people than I could ever imagine. It was 2 days before I even knew the photo existed. The morning after graduation, I tried to carry on like it had been any other Sunday. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with the paper, pretended I was reading the sports section when I was really just staring at the ink until it blurred. I told myself I'd call my kid later in the week, give them space, let them enjoy their celebrations without the shadow of our awkward moment at the door. The second day, the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. It was Frank, an old coworker from the hardware store. "Is that you on Facebook?" he asked. I frowned. "I don't even have Facebook." "Well, someone's got your face on there, sitting in a car in the rain, says it was taken during the graduation at State." I felt a strange jolt in my chest. "What?" "I'll text you the link," he said. When I opened it, the photo filled the screen. There I was, exactly as I'd been that day. Sitting behind the wheel of my old sedan, suit jacket slightly wrinkled, tie pulled just enough to ease the tightness around my neck. The window glass was streaked with rain, and through it you could see my eyes fixed on something far away. The caption read, "Spotted this dad watching the graduation from his car in the pouring rain. Wonder what his story is." No name, no location tag, just that. Below it, comments were already in the hundreds. People were guessing why I'd been out there. Some thought I was late and missed the ceremony. Others assumed I couldn't get a ticket. A few made jokes about my old car, about looking like a scene from a sad movie, but most were kind. Maybe his kid's embarrassed of him. If so, that's on them, not him. Looks like someone who sacrificed a lot to be here. This photo broke me. Someone find him and tell him he's loved. I didn't know how to feel. The image didn't lie, it was me. But it wasn't the whole truth. They didn't know the conversation at the door, the choice I made to turn back. They didn't hear the words that still echoed in my head. By that evening, the post had been shared thousands of times. People were adding their own captions now, turning me into a symbol for every parent who'd been left on the sidelines. Some added quotes about fatherhood, about love, about being present even when you're pushed away. Others started sharing their own stories, photos of parents in hospital rooms, in parking lots, in the backs of school auditoriums. I wasn't sure I wanted to be part of this. The comments that assumed I was some saint made me uncomfortable. I wasn't perfect. I'd made my share of mistakes as a father, but the photo didn't leave room for complexity. It turned me into something simple, something people could rally around. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that image in my head, the way the rain on the glass caught the light, the way my face looked older than I thought it was. I wondered who had taken it. My mind went to the young man with the camera, the one who'd nodded at me twice that day. Part of me wanted to find him, to ask him to take it down. Another part wanted to know what would happen if I didn't. The next morning, I found out I didn't have much choice. The photo had made its way to Twitter, then Instagram. People were tagging it with phrases like #parking-lot-dad and #father's love. I even saw a version of it turned into a black and white print overlaid with a quote about love being shown, not spoken. Somewhere in all of that noise, my phone buzzed again. This time it was my kid. Just a short text, "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen for a long time before typing back. When the dots appeared, then disappeared, then came back. Finally, they wrote, "Tonight." I sent back one word, "Okay." I didn't know what this conversation would be. I didn't know if the photo had embarrassed them or if it had cracked something open. But I knew this, whatever came next, the world had already seen a part of me my kid had tried not to, and there was no taking that back. By the time the sun came up the next day, I wasn't just a photo anymore. I was a headline. It started small, local community pages on Facebook, a few retweets from people who said they couldn't stop thinking about this dad in the rain. Then it grew. Bigger accounts picked it up. Bloggers started writing posts with titles like "The Man in the Parking Lot" and "A Father's Love Caught Between Raindrops." By mid-morning, my phone was buzzing every few minutes. I didn't answer half the calls because they were from numbers I didn't know. The voicemails I did get were a strange mix. Reporters asking for interviews, strangers thanking me for showing the world what real love looks like, and one woman who just cried into the phone and said she wished her father was still alive so she could call him. I didn't know how to respond to any of it. I sat at the kitchen table, coffee going cold in front of me, scrolling through page after page of strangers talking about me like I was a character in a movie. They were filling in the blanks of my life with whatever story they wanted to tell. Some people guessed I was a widower. Others decided I was a dad who'd worked 3 jobs to pay for college but couldn't afford a ticket to the ceremony. A few even imagined I'd been banned for reasons that made me some kind of tragic hero. Almost no one guessed the truth. That's the thing about the internet. It loves a simple story. And Dad watched graduation from the parking lot in the rain was as simple as it got. It didn't matter why I was there or what had been said that morning. What mattered was the image and what people wanted to see in it. By lunchtime, the photo was on the homepage of 2 national news sites. One headline read, "Viral photo of father watching graduation in rain captures hearts nationwide." Another went with, "When love sits in the parking lot." A friend from church texted me a screenshot. "You're on CNN's Instagram," she wrote, followed by 3 exclamation points. I didn't click the link. Around 2 in the afternoon, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find a young woman holding a microphone and a man with a camera slung over his shoulder. "Mr. Henderson?" she asked. I nodded cautiously. "We're from Channel 8 News. We were wondering if we could talk to you about the graduation photo that's been going viral." I gripped the edge of the door. "I'm not sure I have anything to say." She gave me the kind of smile people use when they think they can win you over. "People have been so moved by the image. We think your story could inspire even more." I shook my head. "It's not a story I asked to tell." She hesitated, then nodded. "If you change your mind, here's my card." After they left, I sat back down at the table and stared at the little rectangle of cardstock until it blurred. The truth was, I wasn't angry at the people who'd taken the photo or shared it. I wasn't even sure I was angry at my kid anymore. What I felt was exposed. Like the part of me I'd always kept private, the part that loved quietly, stubbornly, had been dragged out into the open for strangers to dissect. That night, I couldn't escape it. Even without the TV on, even without checking my phone, it was everywhere. A neighbor dropped by to say she'd seen me all over Facebook and thought I looked so noble. The cashier at the grocery store told me she'd cried when she saw the post. And then just before bed, my kid called, "Dad." Their voice was quieter than usual. "Yeah, I saw the photo. I waited. They've been sending it to me all day. Friends, classmates, even my professor mentioned it. Everyone's saying you're like the dad of the year or something." I didn't know what to say to that. "I didn't tell anyone to take it," I said finally. "I know, but now," their voice trailed off. "Now everyone's asking me why you weren't inside. What am I supposed to tell them?" There it was, the question they cared about, not how I felt, not whether it hurt, just what they were supposed to say so the story stayed neat. "You could tell them the truth," I said. There was a long silence. I could hear them breathing on the other end. "Dad, I'm sorry, okay? I didn't think it would blow up like this. I didn't think you'd ask me to stay outside," I said, my voice low. Another pause. "Can we talk in person?" "Yeah," I said, though part of me wanted to say no. We agreed to meet the next evening. The following day, the photo hit its peak. It was on morning talk shows, printed in the local paper, even turned into a meme with captions that made me wince. People started tagging me in posts even though I didn't have an account. Some wrote long stories about their own parents, using my image as a backdrop. I walked into the diner for lunch and the waitress poured my coffee without asking, then patted my shoulder. "You're famous now," she said. "I'd rather not be," I told her. "Too late," she said and walked away. On the way home, I stopped at a red light and caught sight of myself in the side mirror. Same face, same eyes, same lines carved by years of worry and work. But now, to half the country, I was parking lot dad. And I couldn't decide if that was a blessing or a burden. It was just after 6 in the evening when I heard it. A knock, firm but hesitant, like the person on the other side wasn't sure they wanted me to answer. I knew who it was before I even opened the door. They were standing there in jeans and a hoodie, hair still damp from the rain that had started up again. In their hands, they clutched the diploma case like it might shield them from whatever this conversation was going to be. "Hey," they said. "Hey," I replied. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us was thick with all the things we hadn't said, not just since graduation, but for years. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside and they walked past me into the living room. They glanced around like they were seeing the place for the first time, even though they'd grown up here. The same recliner in the corner. The same photos on the walls, except now there was one more space where their mother's picture used to hang. They sat on the edge of the couch, hunched forward, elbows on their knees. "I guess we should talk about all this." "All this," I echoed. "You mean the photo?" They nodded. "It's everywhere. People keep asking me about it. Some of my friends think it's sweet. Others," they trailed off, eyes flicking toward the floor, "they think I'm awful." I didn't say anything. "I didn't mean for it to be like that," they continued. "That morning, I didn't want to feel out of place. Everyone's parents were dressed a certain way and You didn't want me to embarrass you," I said, not as a question but as a fact. They winced. "I didn't mean it like." "Yes, you did," I said, my voice quieter now. "And I get it. Maybe when I was your age, I cared about how things looked too. But here's the thing, you only get a few moments like that in life. Big milestones. And I was willing to stand in the rain just to be close to yours." They looked up then, eyes glossy. "I know, and I'm sorry. I've been thinking about it since the photo. It made me realize what I actually did that day." We sat in silence for a while, the rain pattering against the windows like it was trying to join the conversation. "You know," I said finally, "that picture doesn't tell the whole story. People see a dad in the rain and they think it's pure selflessness. But they don't know the words that came before. They don't know I was out there because you told me to be." "I hate that I said that," they whispered. I leaned back in my chair. "I hate that you felt like you had to." They rubbed their palms over their jeans. "So, what now?" "That depends," I said. "Do you want to tell people the truth?" They hesitated. "I think I just want to start with you." Something in my chest eased a little at that. We didn't fix everything that night. We didn't hug it out and erase the sting of that morning. But we sat there for a long time talking about little things, their classes, my garden, the way the old truck still stalls in cold weather. And maybe that was enough for now. When they finally stood to leave, they paused at the door. "Dad, yeah, thanks for staying." I almost told them I hadn't had much of a choice, but instead I just said, "You're welcome." As the door closed behind them, I looked toward the recliner in the corner, the one I'd sat in the night after graduation with the sound of the rain still in my ears. The knock had changed something. Not everything, but enough to make me believe that maybe, just maybe, the next time I showed up for them, I'd be let in. They came back 2 nights later. No warning this time, just the sound of a car pulling into the driveway and the soft thud of footsteps on the porch. When I opened the door, they were standing there with 2 mugs in hand, steam curling from the lids. "I brought coffee," they said, almost sheepishly. I stepped aside to let them in. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd once helped them with homework, where we'd blown out candles on birthdays, where we'd argued about curfews and grades. For a while, we just sipped in silence. Then they set their mug down and said, "I think we should talk about more than the photo." I nodded. "Yeah, we should." They looked down at their hands. "I know you've done a lot for me, Dad, more than I've ever really said. And I think part of me didn't want to see it because if I did, I'd have to face how much I've taken for granted." I leaned back, the chair creaking under me. I wasn't keeping score. I know, but I was, in my head. I kept telling myself I needed to be separate, independent, and I thought that meant keeping you at arm's length. Independence doesn't mean pretending your parents don't exist, I said gently. They met my eyes then, and there was something raw there. That day, I saw you, and I thought about my friends seeing you too. I didn't want them to think I was different or that my family wasn't like theirs. But now I see, my family isn't like theirs, and that's not a bad thing. I swallowed hard. You know, I wasn't embarrassed to be there. Not in that suit, not in that car. The only thing I felt embarrassed about was realizing you didn't want me inside. They flinched. I hate that I made you feel that. We sat there, the rain starting up again outside like it had been waiting for its cue. You remember that time you were 8 and your team lost every baseball game that season? I asked. I still came to everyone, not because I thought you'd win, but because I wanted you to know I was there. That's what I thought I was doing at your graduation. They nodded slowly, and I pushed you away. Yeah, I said, but here's the thing, you called me after you came here. That tells me there's still something worth showing up for. They reached for their coffee again but didn't drink it. I can't change what happened, but I can tell you I see it now. All of it. And I don't want the last big moment we have together to be me shutting you out. For the first time in days, I felt something loosen in my chest. That's a start, I said. We talked for hours after that, about Mom, about the years after she was gone, about how hard it was for both of us to figure out where the other fit. There were pauses, moments where neither of us knew what to say, but we didn't rush past them. We let the quiet sit with us, not as something to fear, but as space we could both share. By the time they stood to leave, the rain had stopped. They lingered at the door, hands in their hoodie pocket. Next time, they said, I want you in the front row. I smiled, a real one this time. I'll hold you to that. And when the door closed behind them, I realized this conversation hadn't erased the hurt, but it had rewritten the ending. A week after our long talk, the weather turned again. The forecast had called for clear skies, but by late afternoon, clouds had rolled in thick and low, the kind that make the air smell like rain before the first drop falls. I was in the driveway, checking the oil in the old sedan when I heard a car pull up. It was them. No ceremony this time, no hoodie pulled tight like armor. Just a simple smile as they got out, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. Want to go for a drive? They asked. We ended up on the same road that led past the university. The sky had opened up by then, rain spattering across the windshield. I half expected them to turn off before we reached the campus, but they didn't. Instead, they pulled into the parking lot, the same spot I'd taken that day. We sat there, engine off, rain drumming steady overhead. I wanted to see it from your side, they said quietly. The way it looked to you. I didn't speak right away. The view hadn't changed much. The auditorium doors still visible through the sheet of rain, the sidewalk glistening under the streetlights. But sitting here with them beside me, it felt different. They leaned back, watching the rain trace slow lines down the glass. I used to think love was supposed to be loud. Big gestures, big speeches. But you've always been the kind of person who just shows up and stays, even if no one notices. That's what parents do, I said. Or at least that's what I thought we were supposed to do. They nodded. I see that now. I'm sorry it took me so long. We stayed there for a long while, not talking, just listening to the rain. There was nothing to prove anymore, no need to be anywhere else. Finally, they reached over and tapped the dashboard. You know, if someone took our picture right now, it'd still be a dad in a car in the rain. But this time, I'd be in the frame too. I smiled at that. When the rain slowed, we drove back to my place. Before they got out, they said, I'll be here Sunday. We'll cook together like old times. And then they were gone, taillights disappearing into the damp gray evening. That night I sat in my recliner and thought about everything that had happened, the morning at the door, the hours in the car, the photo, the tidal wave of strangers' kindness, and the conversation we should have had years ago. If you're hearing this, maybe you've been on one side of that story. Maybe you've been the one watching from the parking lot, or the one who didn't realize someone was out there for you. Either way, I hope you find your way to the same thing we did, acceptance. Because in the end, love doesn't need the front row. It just needs a place to sit, even if it's in the rain. Thank you for listening to my story. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. And may your next big moment be shared with the people who'd wait outside for you, no matter the weather.